Hey guys, sorry I can't be there today, but today we're going to do phase shift. So if you remember from last time we were together, the way we're going to find phase shift is we are going to take the opposite of C over B. And it's going to shift us left and right. So the best thing to do is just go ahead and jump into an example. So first we'll start with something that just has phase shift in it. So we'll talk about f of theta equals the sine of theta plus pi over 2. So first of all, if we want to look at, alright, so we got amplitude, period, whoopsies, phase shift, and midline. So my A value here is 1, the number out in front. So my amplitude is 1. The period is going to be 2 pi because my B value right here is 1. So 2 pi over 1 is 2 pi. Phase shift is going to be the opposite of C over B. So this pi over 2 right here, that's my C. So I'm going to have the opposite of C, negative pi over 2, over my B value, which is 1. So negative pi over 2 divided by 1 is negative pi over 2. And then my midline is going to be at 0, since that's my D value over there. Alright, so first of all, if you remember me talking about what we skip by, what we're going to do is we're going to take that period and figure out what we skipped by. So I'm going to take 2 pi and divide it by 4. I always divide by 4. So I'm going to take pi over 2 divided by 4, and I end up with pi over 2. So that is what I'm going to skip by. Alright, so when we want to graph this thing out, there we go. Now, usually, my graph would start at 0, right? So I would start with sine is at the midline at 0, and cosine is at a maximum at 0. But I'm shifting to the left pi over 2. So instead of starting at 0, my first guy is going to be at negative pi over 2. And then I go with what I skip by. So I have negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2 . So then my next mark is going to be at 0 here. And then I will add pi over 2 to that to get my next tick mark, which is going to be at pi over 2. And then I add pi over 2 again. So now I have 2 pi over 2, which is pi. And then I'm going to add pi over 2 over again. And so 2 pi over 2 plus another pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. So I have my 5 little spots. And since I want to graph sine always starts off at the midline. And then I have a maximum up here at 1. Let me go ahead and label him. Here's 1. Oopsies, that's not negative 1. Oh, hi, kitty. Okay, settle so I can take some notes. There we go. Thank you, Nutbutt. Negative 1. All right. So I have a midline at negative pi over 2. The next guy has to be a maximum. So at 0, I have a maximum. Then after that, I have to be at the midline. So at pi over 2, I'm at the midline. Then I have another minimum after that, and then I'm back at the midline. So there we go. So that's a nice basic one where stuff doesn't get too disgusting. All right. Now, remember, those little blue guys are just there for me to show you this is how you add fractions. So you don't have to have those guys on your graph. That's just to help you out. All right. Let's look at another one. So we'll do g of x equals the cosine of x over 2 minus pi over 4 plus 2. Amplitude, period, phase shift, and midline. Actually, I'm going to move that over a little bit so I have some more room. There we go. So my amplitude is going to be the number out in front of the cosine. So that is 1. My b value, if you notice that, that's the same thing as 1/2 times x. So my b value is going to be 1/2. So when the period, we find that by taking 2 pi divided by b. So I have, oopsies, 2 pi divided by 1/2. Remember to divide by a fraction, I multiply by the reciprocal. So I'm going to take 2 pi times 2. Oh, I ran out of room. We'll just do it down here. So then I have 2 pi over 1 times 2 over 1, which is going to leave me with 4 pi. So my period is going to be 4 pi. We'll move phase shift down a little bit so we have some more room. Woo. There she goes. All right. Phase shift is negative c over b. So the opposite of c is going to be positive pi over 4 divided by, my b value is 1/2. And then I'll go ahead and do what I did before. I'll move midline down too. There we go. So to divide by a fraction, I have to multiply by the reciprocal. So I have pi over 4 times 2 over 1, which gives me 2 pi over 4, which simplifies to positive pi over 2. The midline is that guy down there at the end, so I have 2 over there, so y equals 2. All right, let's graph him. Oopsies. Why can't I draw a decent line? Come on. There we go. Okay. So, instead of starting at 0, because of my phase shift, I am moving to the right pi over 2, right? So I'm going to start at pi over 2. Now I need to find out what I'm going to skip by. So I'm going to take 4 pi, and I always divide the period by 4. So 4 pi divided by 4 gives me pi. So that is what I'm going to skip by. That's what I'm going to add every time to get my next tick mark. So I want to add pi each time. All right, so remember pi, if you're upset about not having common denominators, pi is the same thing as 2 pi over 2. So 1 pi over 2 plus 2 pi over 2 gives me 3 pi over 2. And then I add pi again, but I'm going to add it as 2 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2 plus 2 pi over 2 gives me 5 pi over 2. Add pi again as 2 pi over 2. And I end up with 7 pi over 2. I'll add another pi over 2 again. Or, I'm sorry, 2 pi over 2. So I have just plain old pi. And I'll end up with 9 pi over 2. So when I graph this out, I'm going to start at pi over 2. And then I had, let's see, this is stretched out a little bit. Usually that would be pi. 3 pi over 2. 5 pi over 2. I don't think I'm going to have room to make it all the way over to 9 pi. Oh, hope you had that written down. Alright, there we go. 7 pi. Here's 7 pi over 2. Here's 9 pi over 2. Oh, right. So usually when we start at 0, oh man, we still have like midline and stuff. I'm sorry, guys. So my midline is going to be here at 2. So I like to put a dotted line through here. You don't have to. Won't bother me. All right. So I'm graphing cosine. So instead of starting at 0, I'm going to start my stuff at pi over 2. So cosine starts at a maximum. Since my amplitude is 1, I'm going to go 1 above. And then the next guy I have is at the midline. And then the next guy I have is down for a minimum. And then I'm back at the midline. And then I have a maximum. Sorry, this all kind of ran into each other there. But, there we go. So, this guy is nice and stretched out horizontally, which is kind of what we expect when we have a B value of 1/2. It should kind of stretch it out a little bit. And then we were shifted over. Alright, let's look at another one. Maybe I can keep it better organized this time. Ooh, this one's going to be fun. That's how you know it's not going to be good. I'm so sorry. You never want to hear your math teacher say, ooh, this is going to be fun. It's a bad time. H of theta equals -2 sine of 2 theta plus pi over 3 minus 5. Nice and beefy. That's everything we need to find real quick. I'll give myself some extra room. Alright, so the amplitude is going to be absolute value of my A value. So since A is -2, the absolute value of -2 is +2. But the negative is important because remember, that's going to reflect me over the x-axis. So I always put myself a little note so that way I don't make that mistake. And I forget to reflect. I don't want to do that. Period, remember, is 2 pi over B. B is 2. So 2 pi divided by 2 is pi. Phase shift, I take the opposite of C over B. So the opposite of c is negative pi over 3 over my b value, which is 2. So this is what I would do. I take that as negative pi over 3 times 1 over 2. So when I multiply that fraction together, I end up with negative pi over 6. So that's how I got that. There we go. And then my midline is going to be at y equals negative 5. So one thing we should do, we need to find out what we're going to skip by. Every time I take the period and I divide it by 4. So the period is pi, divided by 4 is pi over 4. So here we go. Let's draw ourselves a nice little graph here. There we go. Oh, hello again, kitten. Can I please take notes? Okay, come on. You're a good kitty. Good. Yeah, I love you too. Alright, so instead of starting at 0, I am now moved to the left pi over 6. So now I'm going to be at negative pi over 6. I'm going to move this up a smidge. I'm going to be at negative pi over 6. Now, I'm supposed to skip by pi over 4, right? So I'm going to add pi over 4 right here. Now, those guys are not the same fraction, right? So here are your options. You can use your calculator, or you can just get some common denominators. So the common denominator between pi over 6, or with 6 and 4, the least common denominator is going to be 12. So we can think about this as negative pi over 6 is the same thing as negative 2 pi over 12. And every time I'm going to add, if I want my denominator to be 12, I have to multiply by 3. So I have 3 pi over 12. So I'm going to add 3 pi over 12 every time. So I start off at negative 2 pi over 12. And then I'm going to add 3 pi over 12. So negative 2 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 is 1 pi over 12. And then I will add 3 pi over 12 again. 1 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 gives me 4 pi over 12. Plus another 3 pi over 12 gives me 7 pi over 12. Plus another 3 pi over 12. Oh, that's not the same color. Oh well. Gives me 10 pi over 12. So then we'll just go through and simplify these guys. So I'm still going to be at negative pi over 6. Pi over 12 can't be simplified. 4 pi over 12 is the same thing as pi over 3 once we simplify. 7 pi over 12 can't be simplified. And 10 pi over 12 is 5 pi over 6 once we simplify. Do I have to simplify? Yes, you do. So I'm going to start off at negative pi over 6. Then I am at pi over 12. Then I'm over here at pi over 3. Then I'm over here at 7 pi over 12. Then I'm over here at 5 pi over 6. Alright, so we got that phase shift figured out. Now my, let's see, midline is going to be down at negative 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, whoops. So there's my midline. just shift them up a little bit so that way I have some room. Good deal, okay. Alright, that's much better. Okay, so I am all ready to graph. Remember, our amplitude is 2, so my upper bound is going to be at -3, and my lower bound is going to be here at -7. So, let's see, my sine, I usually start off at the midline, and when I reflect, that doesn't change anything. So I'm going to stay at the midline. Then I would usually have a maximum next, but since I'm reflected, I'm actually going to have a minimum at pi over 12. Then I'm back at the midline at pi over 3, and then we'll follow our pattern. We'll have a maximum at 7 pi over 12, and then we'll be back at the midline at 5 pi over 6. Good deal. All right, one more. So here is example D. J of x equals 5 cosine of 8x minus 2 pi plus 6. Oh, this would be a big one. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There we go. Good deal. All right. Here we go. Got a little graph rock in there. Here we go. Amplitude, period, phase shift, midline. All right. Here we go. Here we go. So my amplitude is going to be my A value. My A value here is 5. The absolute value of 5 is 5. The period, I'm going to take 2 pi and divide it by my B value. My B value is 8. So when I take 2 pi and I divide it by 8, I end up with pi over 4. Phase shift is going to be the opposite of C over B. So the opposite of my C value is positive 2 pi over my B value, which is 8. That simplifies to be pi over 4. And then my midline is going to be that D value. So it's going to be y equals 6. So let's go ahead and put that midline in first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait. 3, 6. Here we go. All right, and then my amplitude is 5, so I'll count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to be up here at 11. Oopsies, I almost labeled that as 5. There we go, 11. And then my lower bound is going to be down here at 1. So now we just have to figure out what the phase shift situation is. So, usually I start off at 0. Now, because of my phase shift, I'm going to start off at pi over 4. Now I have to figure out what I skip by every time. So, I take the period and I divide it by 4. Remember, dividing by 4 and multiplying by 1/4 are the same thing. So when I take pi over 4 and I multiply it by 1/4, I end up with pi over 16. So that's what I skip by. I'm going to, oopsies. Oh my God, come on, Mrs. Davis, quit putting lines there. Then I'm going to add pi over 16 each time. Now remember, pi over 4, to get a common denominator, multiply both the top and the bottom by 4, so I end up with 4/16. Add another pi over 16, pi over 16. 4 pi over 16 plus 1 pi over 16 is 5 pi over 16. Plus another pi over 16 gives me 6 pi over 16. Plus another pi over 16 gives me 7 pi over 16. Plus another pi over 16 gives me 8 pi over 16. So then we'll simplify each one. We already know that 4 pi over 16 is just pi over 4. 5 pi over 16 can't be simplified. 6 pi over 16 is 3 pi over 8. 7 pi over 16 can't be simplified. 8 pi over 16 is just pi over 2. So go ahead and we'll label these guys out. So we'll start at pi over 4. And then, come on, move, Peanut. Thank you. So we have pi over 4, and then we have 5 pi over 16. Then we have 3 pi over 8. Then we have 7 pi over 16. And then we have pi over 2. So, we will go from there. Alright, so I am graphing cosine. So cosine normally starts at a maximum. So over here at pi over 4, I will start with my maximum at 11. And then I'm at the midline. So I'm at the midline at 5 pi over 16. Then I have a minimum if I follow out my pattern. Then I'm back at the midline. Then I have a maximum. Not the prettiest thing in the world, but I'll take it. All right. So, your homework is posted online. We'll go over questions on everything you have so far on Monday. All right. Have a fantastic day. I will see you guys later.